So we are about to get started. We're live on the YouTube. Hello, people in cyberspace. So welcome to the launch of Fever Spores. You find yourself right now in the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. I am the co-founder with my partner, Donnie Jokum of the Bureau. Thank you. The Bureau, we say, is a government agency for government that does not exist. And this is the service that we provide. Yeah, if you know of a good government, I hear Colombia just got elected. Good for them. We'll get there maybe. Anyway, we are an all-volunteer organization, so we do rely on sales and donations. We have a suggested donation of $10 for tonight. But if money is tight and you want to buy books, you should buy books. That's a great way to support us. Otherwise, if you're able to drop something in here, we appreciate it. There's change in the back. And if you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back of the room by the register, and you'll get an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. Although we are coming to the end of Gay Endurance Month. Soon we will rest. I didn't make that phrase up. Somebody else told me that. Yes, that describes it. We're enduring. But we're super excited to have you all here. Glad we got a full house. And I'm going to introduce the editors of Fever Spores, and then we're going to jump into some readings. So Brian Alessandro is a writer, artist, and filmmaker. His work has appeared in Newsday, Interview Magazine, Bloom, Hank, Huffington Post, Turtle Point Press, Lambda Literary, Edmund White by the Book, and RE and Ideas Journal. He has also written and directed the feature film Afghan Hound, founded the literary journal The New Engagement, and wrote the novel The Unmentionable Man, M-A-N-N. He recently co-adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions. He holds an MA in clinical psychology from Columbia University and has taught the subject for 12 years. So he's a slacker. Nothing. Tom Cardamone is the editor of Crashing Cathedrals, Edmund White by the Book. We did a great reading here for. And is the author of the Lambda Literary Award-winning speculative novella Green Thumb, as well as the erotic fantasy The Lurid Sea and other works of fiction, including 2 short story collections. Additionally, he has edited The Lost Library, Gay Fiction Rediscovered. Please welcome them both.
So I just want to thank everybody for coming this evening. Fever Spores was born in our brain a year and a half ago and came to fruition very quickly. We want to thank the 25 contributors, the essayists who contributed their marvelous essays to this book, and the 7 interviewees who include Chris Kelso, Samuel R. Delaney, Legs McNeil, Debbie Harry, Chris Stein, David Cronenberg, Tony Kushner, Fran Leibovitz. I don't know if you've heard of any of these people. They're up and coming. I tell tomorrow night, Tom and I will be on Culture Connection. Our program director, Dan Zaleski, is actually here this evening. So if you want to check our social media sites, please do so. And it will be tomorrow night at 7 p.m. We'll be interviewed by Matthew Spector, the great Matthew Spector, who wrote Always Crashing in the Same Car. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Tom and I also decided to borrow from Burroughs' cut-up method. He's going to read the first 2 pages of his introduction. I'm going to read the last 2 pages of my conclusion. So we're sort of serving as bookends. We thought it'd be cute and playful. Because we're cute and playful. And Tom will start us off this evening. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Bureau. Thank you, Rebel Satori. Thank you, contributors, for giving your best during some really awful fucking months. We had a lot of fun reading and putting this together. So it was a great pandemic project, one that I thought when we finished the book, the pandemic would be over.
Why isn't it?
I fucked up. I gotta do another book. All right, I'm just gonna read quickly my first 2 pages. The contributors who are reading tonight, when you come up, please introduce yourself. You are reading in the order of the email I sent you and the event listing, so check your phone. Tallahassee, Florida State University, a pale blue kidney bean-shaped pool of my then girlfriend's nondescript apartment complex, 1992. Wallowing in the residue of cheap weed and an oath and an ever-handy thermos of watery Jack and Cokes, deathly thin, I was soaking up the sun. She and I had met during a post-undergraduate semester in London, where I bought so many books around Charing Cross Road that when I packed them for the trip home, the handle came off the suitcase when I attempted to lift it. Stuffed among my prized Philip K. Dick reprints, most of his work was out of print in the States at the time, were pulpy William S. Burroughs paperbacks. I'd scored something from the Nova trilogy, The Soft Machine, The Ticket That Exploded, or Nova Express. I wish I could recall which ones. They had this psychedelic cover that insinuated paranoia over strawberry fields. I enjoyed the surreal cut-up method of the book, the razor sharpness of certain sentences. Whichever books I read, I didn't know they were part of a trilogy, just that the cut-up method worked. It exposed the fallacies of narrative storytelling while serving up a self-aware con game. I felt the author was an admirable hustler, entranced by his own version of the 3-card Monte, and I wanted to know more. I was desperate to be a writer, but afraid to put anything down on paper. I was okay with stalking the darker figures of literature, however, knowing that the entrances I required were all in alleyways or underground. Back in Florida, I read Ted Morgan's literary outlaw, The Life and Times of William S. Burroughs, poolside beneath the withering sun. The drainage pond over my shoulder was a polluted shadow patrolled by a lone, minute alligator, a silent sentinel cutting verdant scum. Satellites of crushed Budweiser cans bounced in his wake. Across from me, an impossibly skinny blonde girl in an American flag bikini would not stop talking to her brunette friend. Endless chatter, wiry white arms tossed across their foreheads. I passed them on the way back to the apartment to refill my thermos. Anyone who has AIDS deserves to die. The blonde girl spat in my direction. I pretended not to hear this. Inside was air conditioning with white stucco walls, bong hits, a quick Marlboro light to heighten the high. I was at the pool again in 15 minutes with a fresh thermos of whiskey, nonplussed by the poisoned arrow hurled at me just moments ago. I had all the armor I needed: girlfriend, the daily anesthesia of drugs and alcohol, sleeping 12 hours every day, pouring myself into books. If death slipped the occasional Valentine's Day card under the door, so be it. That was the price to play a heterosexual charade.
We always have to do this whenever I speak or perform publicly. So yes, my name is Laura Schleifer. I am the first of the contributors to read my piece, so be gentle. And let's see, I have known Brian actually for many years. We worked together on a number of projects together. I am an artivist. That's actually a word that I created years ago to describe my work as an artist activist, theater artist, writer, big activist, and I guess I will begin. So my essay is called The Viral Revolution and Retrolution. One could say that we live in the viral era. Of course, this is not the first time a virus akin to La Corona has ripped through humanity, sucking the life out of millions along with it. But in our own virus-addled era, those microscopic minions of the living dead are but one part of a much larger viral culture overall. It is eerie to think now that just a few short years ago, the first association that might have come to our minds upon hearing the terms virus or viral might have been a computer infection, a computer infected with a Trojan horse, or a meme, or a YouTube video that went viral. The coronavirus is but one symptom of a globalized, hyper-connected world filled with billions of beings passing around billions of ideas, images, memes, messages, money, body fluids, pathogens, and pathogenic versions of all of the above. Viral videos, viral memes, viral trends, viral mass movements, viral terrorism, viral mass shootings, viral police shootings, live stream, dead streams, free trade, sex trade, sexually transmitted diseases, blow your load, viral load, coronavirus, papillomavirus, adenovirus, SARS, MERS, Zika, Ebola, AIDS, viruses spreading like wildfires, wildfires spreading like wildfires. A planet devolving into a crowded, sweaty, flammable flaming ball, a giant controlled animal feedlot operation whirling through space, all life turned into livestock on the stock market, burgeoning with zoonotic diseases, born of frenetic dis-ease. A planet that, as William S. Burroughs once described it, he would take one look at and ask to see the manager. In this current moment, Burroughs' fascination with viruses, both literal and metaphorical, and specifically with the idea of the word, and by extension, all forms of media, as a virus, speaks to our times. This idea of the word as a virus appears repeatedly in Burroughs' work, so much so that when a compendium of his lifetime works was curated, it was simply entitled Word Virus. In his essay, The Electronic Revolution, the author provocatively asserts that the written word is a virus that infected our ancestors and set us apart from the other primates. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was flesh. And in Burroughs' rendition of the Genesis story, the Word is virus, burrowed in flesh, burrowing its way into Adams's brain, and ours, dear readers, infecting all subsequent generations. Of course, if the written word is a virus, then the Bible itself might just be the biggest ultimate infection. Viruses, it should be noted, can infect and control minds, from Entopteroptimus muscae, aka destroyer of insects, which uses a fungus to control insects' brains before killing them, to the viruses that invade the mammalian brain and leave a path of encephalitis in their wake, to La Corona herself. COVID sufferers with no known prior mental health conditions have been reported to exhibit symptoms akin to paranoid schizophrenia after having been infected with the virus, trying to commit suicide, trying to kill family members because they think their loved ones are plotting to murder them, wild hallucinations, and in one case, a woman trying to pass her child through a drive-through window because she was certain that she was being followed and they were after her child. Much like the effects of hallucinogenic drugs on the brain, viruses can make the lines between reality and surreality quite blurry. It is clear that the target of the word virus is the mind, though once the mind is infected, it can affect the rest of the body as well. According to Burroughs, the word virus is a uniquely human pathogen. Indeed, the very foundation of our separation from the rest of animalia. In choosing the written word as the place to draw the invisible boundary line of the human-animal construct, one could say that Burroughs makes a fatal error typical of men who come from his background, i.e. white, wealthy, and patrician, by wiping the vast majority of humanity out. For most human languages never had a written counterpart. Thus, in striving to determine the essential quality that makes one human, Burroughs uses colonizer logic by setting the standard of humanness to that of the colonizer culture's normative. In doing so, he implicitly animalizes all those who came from cultures where the word was not written, a construct that has been used as a foundation of and rationalization for oppression within human society for centuries. Yet, unlike other members of the colonizer class, Burroughs does not necessarily think that this difference is a good thing. Words spread ideas like a plague. If they are rarely spoken, they only infect those they are directly spoken to, or who are close enough to hear them. They remain local in the damage they do. Recorded words, on the other hand, have the potential to become a pandemic, infecting millions or even billions around the globe. They also have the potential to infect generation after generation with the disease, causing Alfred Korzybski, the Polish theorist and founder of general semantics, whom Burroughs references extensively, to describe humans who use written language as time-bending animals. It is for this reason that Burroughs makes the bold claim that while most people believe the spoken word preceded the written, in reality, the written word preceded the spoken. For human spoken languages would never have evolved the way they did if not for the fact that this particular primate's languages were infected with a virus, the written word. The written word was, of course, the original version of the virus, but since then it has mutated into much faster spreading and more potent variants, first through the printing press, and then far more rapidly through TV, radio, video, film, and in our own era of split-second transmission variants, smartphone cameras, social media, YouTube, the entire world entangled in a hyper-connected web of influence. One word can infect billions of brains within seconds of a single spray. Thank you.
Can I take my face underwear off?
Yeah.
I have one question. ¿Dónde está Friendly Bullets? Huh? Where is she? This is gonna happen.
I think she's in France, Charlie.
Oh, well. Okay, hi Sven. It's great to see old friends and new faces. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for making this book happen. Thank you for everyone, my fellow contributors. I'm going to read an excerpt from I guess it's an essay called Junkies, where I basically compare what I was able to unearth about William Burroughs's drug habits and that subculture as compared to the similar fate that my father experienced in his days on earth. So that should set things up. So this is about his first book, which is the first one I read, coincidentally. In my favorite sequences, Lee, the Burroughs character, gets desperate for drug money and decides to work the whole subway with Roy for cash. They spot a flop on a platform bench at 149th Street in Grand Concourse and exit the train to lush roll or pickpocket him while he's passed out. Lee sits next to the drunk and opens a newspaper for cover while Roy goes through his pockets. The victim stirs and mumbles something, shifting his posture. Roy manages to work $8 out of him, which he splits with Lee. On another night, they enter the Times Square subway station and spot a flashily dressed mooch. They follow him to Brooklyn while spying on him from between the subway cars. Once he passes out, they move in. Lee spreads out the New York Times to look like a businessman, and Roy gets to work. When the victim stirs groggily after feeling something and awakening, Burroughs writes, "A Negro sitting opposite us smiled." They work the drunk for cash, but not before he wakes up and confronts Roy. The victim recognizes them and even knows their swindle, disclosing the newspaper trick and teamwork for everyone around them to hear. He demands his money back. Lee and Roy beat him up and make a run for it, splitting the $6 they've stolen while trying to avoid arrest on the street. Their fiercest competitor, the fag, has earned his name by feeling up his victims' legs to spook them while working them for as much as $1,000, which is about $10,000 in 2021. While discussing the origins of his street name, despite his being the most successful pickpocket they know, Roy declares, "He's no more a fag than I am." Not as much, in fact. While the majority of Junkies' primary characters are substance abusers, queers come in at a close second. From the jet set elite Lee dismisses in the prologue to the red-headed hustler he hunts down with his gun after getting robbed in New Orleans. The line between the two is just as blurry at times, yet what struck me most upon rereading it 30 years later was Lee's absolute contempt for queer men. The reason is never addressed, self-hatred one could suggest. William Lee seems to prowl the pages of Junkie while in search of something beyond the fix, beyond sex, that which will provide healing for a wound that is never identified. The post-war New York landscape of soot and heartbreak lingered well into the 70s when I was born, the decade when my father started taking me into Manhattan on the subway. While much will never be known about his torments, clues have endured to reveal the truth behind his silence. The Nixon campaign in 1968, this is a quote, and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Quote from John Ehrlichman, then aide to President Nixon. 1978. The subway doors jolted apart. My father and I stepped out onto the platform on 149th Street in Grand Concourse, where William Lee and Roy lush rolled a drunk over 20 years prior. The crowd dispersed around us, wheels screeching on rails. Once on the 5 Lexington Avenue Express, my dad buried his face in the New York Daily News. I was left to study the residents of my native city, such as those I'd be introduced to years later in Junkie, a novel my dad would have enjoyed reading. He'd left his native Puerto Rico while in his teens, after contending with bad luck most of his life. His mother, Dolores Vazquez Hinorio, suffered a chronic asthma attack home when he was a boy. The town doctor arrived and administered the wrong medication by accident, killing her in front of her husband and 3 sons. The youngest was too small to understand, yet my father, 7, and his oldest brother, 9, never recovered from the shock. Thank you so much.
My name is Sven, and I'm going to start with, excuse me, two quotes from Naked Lunch. And these quotes are both about different factions that Burroughs described as trying to control the world. One, the liquefaction program involves the eventual merging of everyone in the world into one man by a process of protoplasmic absorption. Number two, the divisionists literally divide. They cut off tiny bits of their flesh and grow exact replicas of themselves in embryo jelly. It seems probable, unless the process of division is halted, that eventually there will only be one replica of one sex left on the whole planet. That is one person in the whole world, but who has millions of separate bodies. So with those quotes in mind, this is part of my letter that I wrote to Burroughs 25 years after his death. Dear Pappy, I received your message years ago, but it took me a long time to get around to reading it. Your jokes always made me laugh, but honestly, I thought you were kind of a self-indulgent old junkie. However, I finally began reading your message while on a quadruple dose of those very evil antihistamines you told me about. And under their influence, your words never made more sense to me. Since you've been gone, the liquefactionist agenda has progressed exponentially. Almost everyone is eagerly offering up all their protoplasm for total absorption by control. I've even been guilty of doing this myself on occasion. And the divisionists are unstoppable. The replicas are making replicas of replicas, and everything is getting pretty goddamn thin and worn out. Nobody has much juice left inside them. They farmed it all out. But recently, I did find a very rare holdout. Not long after I read your message, I met this guy, Gus. He's a stanky, hot, crusty punk who lives on the streets. I stopped to listen to him sing, and he charmed and hypnotized me with his sweet, sour music. Then we ate out each other's pits right there on his blanket in front of the lens crafters on 14th Street. After that, we got to be buddies, and pretty soon we were hanging out a lot. Boy, are his flavors delicious. The liquefactionists can't touch Gus, and he refuses to share his protoplasm, even with me, unfortunately. I would happily merge, as you say, Pappy, into one great big blob with him. It would be beautiful, but Gus is wary and suspicious, and I can't blame him. He's got what they used to call scruples. What pulled me towards Gus was that he's all himself. He seemed to have sidestepped the intrusion of all forms of control, and that was exhilarating. But then we had an experience that revealed something unexpected. During the super blood moon, we went back to his tent under the BQE overpass and initiated a powerful sex magic ritual. We grappled and fought and pleasured each other's flesh, laboring upon each other until we were flung from the outer cosmos to the deepest maw of Tartarus. Fire peeled us away from all the infernal jitterbugs of infection and control. And as we teetered between chaos and self-knowledge, we found a strange and almost impossible balance. So raw and so intimate, it quivered on the edge of destruction, like we were wrestling on the rim of a magma chamber. And in that frenzy, a new persona looked out through the heat in Gus's eyes. A fierce and ancient voice spoke from his mouth and told me I must bow down and prolapse my entrails before him. I will teach you, the voice said. Unable to move, I felt a hidden crustacean speak through my lips. There is no room here. I am already using this body. But Gus did not give up. He opened his mouth and bared his teeth, and like something happening far away, I felt his fist slam through my colon meat. You will remember, he cried. Thousands of voices burbled through my lips, and I saw ancient cities and abandoned planets and steaming oceans filled with waving kelp. I saw military parades and moon rockets and conquistadors and covered wagons. I saw cavemen and cinnamon buns and burning buildings and happy children laughing. Somehow, Gus and I were in all those places, all down the ages, through every permutation of everything. We were both always around, but never together. And then, in front of the lens crafters on 14th Street, we met. And finally, for one night in his tent under the BQE, we totally bum-slopped each other until we punched a hole through the protoplasm daddy and the mother cell right out into the fiery beyond. And that was when Gus gave birth to me. He grinned his crafty cat dog grin. Now do you see? I conjured you. You didn't exist before we met. I looked at him, and our eyes connected like an impossible puzzle clicking to its final position. Yes, I remember now. I've been around for a long time, but I didn't finally wake up until I met you, Gus. He leaned into me and took his lips into my mouth, and a spiral nebula exploded and clouds of interstellar dust expanded out through the universe. So much room, so many possibilities. Who knows where insides and outsides begin and where they end? I woke up on the pavement under the BQE. Gus and his tent were gone. I shrank down into my body and stumbled off through the piles of garbage. Thank you.
Hello, good to see you all. I'm Peter Dubé, and as my bio has it, I am the author, co-author, or editor of a dozen books, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, or poetry, both actually. And oh yeah, and this is my mug. So I shall be reading a few extracts from a fairly lengthy essay contributed to the anthology called Out of Control, William S. Burroughs' Queerness and the Cutout Method. It's far too long to read in the allocated time, so I'll read bits of it and try to improvise some sort of connection between them that will stand in for the far more detailed argumentation that takes place in the essay. But y'all should get the gist, okay? So this is it, Out of Control. The work of William S. Burroughs put a crack in the shell of reality for me. And because, as I've written elsewhere, when something opens up, things move through it in both directions. It offered me a way out of the ordinary world. And I am indescribably grateful for that. As many do, I began with junkie and queer. As an already out gay boy who'd paid the price for coming out so young and at that particular time, and never you mind how long ago it was, the latter title resonated very deeply. However, as I continued my exploration and ultimately came to the Nova Cut Up trilogy and its startling juxtapositions and unworldly connections of words and ideas and images, the vibe became so much more general and intense, both to shaking both my picture of the world and my sense of self, as if a wine glass in the presence of a particularly powerful soprano. So by the time I finally got to the essay, Burroughs' essay, The Cut-Up Method of Brian Alessandro, I was gagging for it, because here he explained how he came to those juxtapositions, those combinations, those connections, that quivering nexus that baffles ontology. So I was there, I was ready for it. And so it sparked my own work with cut-ups, and I embarked upon a lengthy period of experimentation with them. And this led to a much richer understanding of Burroughs' work. But because it pointed me towards a source of deep, psychologically complex and sometimes troubling imagery, and it gave me broad kinds of permission. I was ecstatic. This was exactly what the gay outsider and aspiring writer I then was needed at that time. The cut-up told me that language was stuff and could be handled as such. It could be shaped, moved around, torn apart, and put back together in new and interesting combinations. And that such processes revealed enormous things about both language and the world in which it operated. Language was, in short, material. And that insight has stayed with me forever. And given that so much of the world we live in and our experience of it is the product of language, of discourses, it meant that the world itself was every bit as transformed. Yeah, that was a big one for me, because as I kept moving on through the years and got gayer and gayer and gayer. We're not done yet. I discovered that wide swaths of queer life, certainly large parts of gay life, as I've experienced it, are marked by more open and diverse approaches to sex and sexuality and family structures and gender presentations and language and more. And the new formulations we come up with about the things we are often undertaken by dismantling or cutting up normative ideas and coming up with things, partners, thruples, fuck buddies, chosen families, leather families, voguing families, And these things show us the rigidity, even the coercive power of the traditional family and its superstructure, the capitalist state, even as they undo it in some ways. Further examples come to mind all easily, right? Certainly I have heard the word daddy, for example, used to denote at least 4 or 5 different kinds of relationships. And I have used it myself in at least 3 different contexts. And in acknowledging such basic coinages, we have scarcely begun to look at the vast range of manifestations of cutting things up as a practice. Considering the ways in which the collective homes that were a prominent part of the early gay liberation movement or current gay leather and biker clubs or voguing houses, I said before, reconfigure absolutely foundational notions of kinship in ways central to countless queer lives, whether lived in the dominant social mode or within more subcultural LGBTQ plus world. And what of practices like street cruising or park cruising and the manner in which they cut up public space, transforming its normative uses and creating new affective forms. And if the cut up is about change, transformation, and that focus is why it strikes back at the hegemonic understanding of reality, which we may just as well, joining with Burroughs, call control. By taking the raw material of subjectivity and the social and transforming it, queerness does much the same. Like the cut-ups, it creates zones of freedom and creativity within the social space of discourse. It opens up to reprise the image with which I began. A cry. And it's one that has proven to be more capacious than I might have imagined starting out. Indeed, it's big enough to escape through.
Thank you.
Gotta cover the mug up.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tim Young, and I'm a librarian. I just want to thank Brian and Tom and the Bureau. And big shout out, my friend Jerry Roscoe is here. He may not agree, but he's been one of the biggest promoters and influences on me, and I'm happy to see him. But I also only had one dream in my life, which was to sit on a stool in front of microphones. So I'm going to read about 66% of my essay. His voice. At the teen age, when I was searching library shelves looking for queer voices, I chose down and rough and dirty and ready types like John Ricci and Jean Genet. I held William S. Burroughs at arm's length. He was ambiently present in the books that I shelved at the public library. I remember the colorful cover of The Western Lands and other volumes in his late trilogy. I learned to listen politely as straight friends of mine went on and on about his writing, short stories, and film adaptations that brought his paranoid characters to life. It is never a good thing to tell a 20-year-old what they should be reading. Even worse when that young person is the dedicated book recommender himself. Every push toward Burroughs was another reason for me to stand fast in my ignorance of his work. I saw Burroughs principally as a beat writer along those selfish macho characters Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassaday, buff, swarthy men who flaunted their patriarchal privilege under the oversized flag labeled finding oneself. When I did encounter their work, I didn't like it, so I refused to approach it. I'm not a fan of William S. Burroughs, but you can't grow up as a reader without confronting him. But in the same way, a reluctant child gets tricked into eating something bitter and healthy, there was a mode of entry into his work, his voice. I discovered it by way of the Giorno poetry systems, specifically the 1981 album, You're the Guy I Want to Share My Money With. A landmark project that deserves praise for many things. Its title, the full-blown introduction to the wider world of the genius of Laurie Anderson, and its innovative format, a 4-sided double vinyl LP set, one side each by Anderson, by John Giorno, and by Burroughs, and the fourth, a multi-groove side that played one of the three writers depending on where the needle landed. A triumph of analog that cannot be duplicated digitally. These recordings show Anderson at her most interesting phase of development, and allow Burroughs to assert his presence for another generation of listeners and readers while keeping Giorno, an underappreciated national poetry treasure, in the mix. Burroughs shows himself to be a master storyteller and joke maker. A later Giorno Poetry Systems compilation, A Diamond Hidden in the Mouth of a Corpse, 1985, with its Keith Haring cover, put Burroughs in the shared company of Pousse Deux, Sonic Youth, and Cabaret Voltaire, introducing him to an even wider audience. Therefore, my acquaintance with William S. Burroughs didn't happen by my reading him. Instead, Burroughs read to me. It was an oral acquaintance, and it pretty much remained on that level. His voice was the gateway, an amalgam of mesmerism, threat, calm, and matter-of-factness that aligned with the memory of my own grandfather's animated tale-telling. I grew up listening to family stories. This medium of interaction was a welcome and happy one for me. I was a dedicated reader from the moment I could hold open a book, but eventually I realized that the oral tradition was important in my family. Jokes, histories, bizarre accounts of something that happened to the acquaintance of a friend of a relative. I suppose Burroughs came on not like a stranger in a bar, but as a weird uncle who communicated a passel of anecdotes relating to our much wider family history. And Laurie Anderson, what branch of the family did she belong to? I could trace part of her genealogy through Reed, her genius life partner, who was also influenced by Burroughs and was promoted by Andy Warhol and who studied with Delmore Schwartz. To quote Blue Mask, my daedalus to your blue. But this masculine thread could only be a footnote to any explanation of the very deep queer kinship I feel with her. So sorry for the Laurie Anderson thing, but I have to say it. Burroughs' voice has a long history, parallel to and in a sense equal to his writing. His first spoken word record, Call Me Burroughs, was recorded in Paris in 1965 and issued by the English Bookshop, with the US edition pressed in 1966 by ESP Disc. The record, although issued in a limited edition, had a major impact on a number of writers and musicians of the era, the Beatles, David Bowie, Bob Dylan, even Steely Dan. The next major audio effort by Burroughs was in the form of a double LP made with John Giorno in 1975. It included passages from band favorites such as the Wild Boys and Junkie, but also featured a newer work, a long section of Cities of the Red Night, which would be published in 1981. But the real breakthrough of Burroughs was as a stand-up reader happened in December 1978 at the three-day Nova convention, celebrating his work and bringing him together with younger artists he had influenced, including Philip Glass, Patti Smith, and Laurie Anderson. Giorno Poetry Systems issued a pared-down recording culled from the event in 1979. Burroughs' late life career as a touring showman was launched, and it would hold him in good stead, or at least rent money, for several years. More records followed in the 1980s and 90s. The Doctor is on the Market, Breakthrough in the Grey Room, a pair of popular releases from Island Records, Dead City Radio, and Spare Ass Annie and Other Tales, both produced by Hal Wilner, longtime music consultant for Saturday Night Live and producer of albums by Anderson and Reed and other amazing projects. More audiobooks, and then after his death, the inevitable remix project, William S. Burroughs in Dub, 2014. Burroughs' voice is now readily available. You can find him on iTunes and Spotify and many other digital locales. So it is much easier to encounter that monotone that is in fact not monotonous, and the drone that is not really truly droning, the detached voice that in reality holds you and reassures you that there will eventually be some moral to the story. The danger of this availability is, of course, its decontextualization. Burroughs, like any artist online, is embodied in a way that makes one element of his art fungible. Thus, some listeners might only encounter Burroughs in samples used by other artists such as Cut Chemist and Beat Manifesto, or in the form of the supremely enjoyable distillation of Naked Lunch that is Bomb the Bass and Justin Warfield's Bug Powder Dust, the Kruder and Dorfmeister session, of course. This entree via sampling is what reminded me more recently of the power of his voice. About 15 years ago, I picked up an odd compilation of songs by Malcolm McLaren, Tranquilize. The CD features the track Mexico, Manhattan, and Malibu, which begins with an excerpt of Burroughs reading from Naked Lunch, specifically the section Bradley the Buyer, the first work on the talismanic 65-66 album, Call Me Burroughs, laid over Willie Bobo's 1962 instrumental track Trinidad. I'm just going to skip the whole section because I can't really do Burroughs' voice. McLaren segues from Burroughs' interview with Jane Mansfield from the early 60s, in which she expounds on her love of Californian modernism. Like so many things McLaren created, he took opposite cultural aesthetics and paired them just by the fact of their shared temporal existence, allowing the listener to discover linkages. This work made me find Burroughs again, even though it still didn't make me a true reader of his books. I suppose long before then I had reached an equilibrium regarding how close and how deep I wanted to be to him and his world. I'm just not that into him. I listen and observe from a remove, a bit like stopping to peer through a murky window at a boxing gym versus jumping to the ring while still wearing my flat leather shoes and street clothes. I'll leave that be. I want to maintain my distance. One more thing. I had a friend, my best teenage friend, who shortly after I found out that he was not gay, became enamored of, nearly obsessed with Burroughs, so much so that he moved to Lawrence, Kansas to be near the man and his aura and his reputation. So in allegiance to this friend, I did pick up Burroughs' books again, intending to encounter the man on paper, but it didn't stick. I gave up on his printed word. To be honest, I give up on a lot of books in the same way I allow myself to walk out on movies that don't agree with me. It's no badge of honor to force myself through a work for the sole virtue of adding a title to my list of accomplishments. Life is short.
All right.
Hello. My name is Leroy Kangalee, and I just want to say thank you, Brian and Tom, for putting all this together. The book is extraordinary. I'm very humbled to be around all these great writers, by the way. It's quite humbling. I haven't been in a room with a lot of really good writers in a long time. A long, long time. Very humbling. But I also want to say that as a straight art, a Black radical artist, I have to, it would be dishonest and immoral if I didn't say how seismic the influence of the queer outlaw artists have been on me. And almost in the way that a lot of white artists get permission from Black artists. You know, that's just a fact. It is. The nerve, to be honest, and to be dangerous, it's true. I got from virtually all the great queer art, you know, Janae and Burroughs and all these guys. So I just had to say that because I thought it was important. And that warrants a whole other discussion, maybe even a book. But anyway, I want to read to you a little bit here from my essay. It's called How Burroughs Showed Us That the Word is a Virus and an Empire which must be constantly crushed and rebuilt, or the interzone via Kangalee. Every time you say it, the white man laughs. And so does his little voice inside. All the words were the same, vile and empty with a little hanging inside each one. Single space, no more clock. Hands rule the empty waves. The word, the word, the word hurts. I always had the desire to turn the screenplay format into a personal mode of expression that I felt I could break, contort, dismantle, and rekindle, almost the way that Burroughs did, or B as I call him, with the novel. Unlike B, I am not a genius, but the temptation to make others see in a new way always appealed to me. It seduced me from being an entertainer who was an actor, who conceded almost painfully at first that he was an artist. There's something almost traumatic taking that leap, admitting to yourself that everything you previously believed and pretended to believe were not real, meaning that they had no gravity. They were just examples of traumas of the authentic man struggling in an inauthentic world. One thing I know with full certainty is that when you approach the work of a major artist, you don't really learn much, you just get humbled. That's all that happens. You've entered a church of someone else's making, and you have no idea how it was formed, how it was actually built. The stories, the tales, the legends mean nothing when confronted with someone so awkwardly beautiful and recalcitrant as Burroughs. And for the writer who lives words and reimagines them, this is everything. Being enraptured by the possibility, the endless vistas of the word. I see it all, the words, emotions, actions, gestures, sounds, as beautiful contents of an arsenal I have no control over. Unlike guns, they don't need to be cleaned or kept locked away. They don't exist to annihilate. But sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can kill. Sometimes they do. Burroughs had understood the strange power of literature and its command over us. He was suspicious of the government's use of words and language, and the only way to recover one's soul is to combat it with your own sense of language, your own sense of writing words. In the beginning, as Laura Schleifer said, there was the word, right? All religions begin with the word, and all wars start and end with the promise or the period of a poem. December 1995. I read somewhere language is the virus from outer space, a disease communicable by conversing. Now these words by B made the hairs on my arms stand up, as did the song by Laurie Anderson, by the way. And it had never dawned on me until I was about 19 and was a patient in New York's Payne Whitney Mental Health Clinic, that language could actually be the basis of a new form of acting or theater, whatever. Isn't that what all young people are supposed to be excited about? These types of ideas? It's the end of the 20th century. It's time to figure out how we could reinvigorate this into modern art. 1999 was approaching. What did it bring us? Well, not chaos and new meanings, just more order and Rudolph Giuliani's reign of terror and the end of Times Square, freedom, weirdness, essentially art in New York City. Order, control, these were becoming the shiny talismans of the era. Apple and iPhones were merely a step or two around the corner. Fascism was creeping in via consumerism. We were giving up. Control needs time to exercise control, like death, wrote Burroughs. He said, control is a parasite living off the human organism. I remember once reading how Ishmael Reed had said he would cite a text as if it had been something Malcolm X wrote, right? And then he would later tell people that it was Burroughs, which I find fascinating, because you could do that, some of this stuff. You know, that's brilliant. I've been trying to find the text. Of course, I can't find it, but hopefully I can. How to play William Tell when you have writer's block. Rule number 1, never use a real apple. Rule number 2, if you can avoid it, never use a real person, ever. Rule number 3, guns are only as accurate as the finger that writes. Angst is something that Burroughs seemed to have no connection to as he grew older, I think. There was a practical approach and sensibility he had to virtually everything. Had he been a director or conductor, he'd have led his ensemble with a scalpel. There's no way in hell that in 2020 there could exist a celebrated living author, thinker who gravitated towards guns and had such a casually violent past as Burroughs. Especially an LGBTQI writer, a moniker he might have detested, I don't know, but I don't think he wanted understandings. I think he may have sought justice and gave warnings, but Burroughs was not a queer obsessed with acceptance. I think Burroughs was perfectly at ease with his own political beliefs, even the dodgy conscience he wrestled with his whole life. But it had nothing to do with being white or not doing enough for the oppressed. For he himself was both oppressor and oppressed, victim and victimizer. The universe of art is a dreadful place, not one intended for the weak-hearted or the brittle-minded. It is a bastion of contradiction, but not hypocrisy. All artists are the sum of their contradictions. Amiri Baraka once said, he who cannot think, cannot feel. It is a Western imperialist mythology that emotions are the opposite of thought. And through words and rational text, this argument has been made for the past 400 years alone. Burroughs was aware of this. He had seen it all under or through an eyelid as the terror of the universe played out in the other eyelid. Did you know you could have two separate dreams in either eyelid under the influence of heroin? The horse gallops in one and neighs in the other. Now that's queer. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Napoli Brooks. Thanks so much to Brian and Tom for putting together this wonder of a book. It's a really honor to be part of it with so many distinguished authors. It's interesting, like writing this essay became kind of a milestone in my writing because I'm a fiction writer. So when somebody asks me to write something, my feeling is like, well, don't bring me into it. I don't want to talk about me. So this was like a first chance to really to talk about myself in the first person in my writing, which I haven't really done a lot of, and also explore my queerness, because I'm like, oh shit, I'm gay. I think it's obvious in right? So when it's kind of a milestone in my writing too, because when Tom and Brian asked me to write this piece, I ended up just taking the bull by the horns and sending them this massive text about paranoia in America and growing up gay and feeling paranoid because you don't know how to articulate how you're feeling as a young person. And then I kind of went into some real episodes of paranoia I had in my life, and then people who experienced paranoia around me, including my ex, who secretly kept a Hoover file of black books on me. So that's a true story. I don't think I deserve it. Maybe I did. But also in my trip to Burroughs' house in Lawrence, Kansas. So I put all of that in the essay. And so Tom and Brian wrote me back like, what the fuck is all this? You're supposed to do like one page about how much you're learning about Burroughs. This is about you being like, taken into limos, driven around town by producers who want you to write Black Goonies. And, so it happened. So then I ended up writing a highly personal essay because Burroughs was actually connected to my coming out. It was a really kind of violent coming out in some ways, but that's in the essay here. So I thought I'd just change it up a little bit and just take little segments of the whole essay that I wrote about paranoia and things. So I'm just gonna give you 5 minutes of that. So I went on to spend 8 weeks at Friends Hospital in Philadelphia, founded by the Quakers in the early 19th century as, quote, the asylum for the relief of persons deprived of their use of reason. Upon admission, I had been asked if I felt like I was being watched. So before closed-circuit cameras mounted on each corner of the room, I forthrightly answered, yeah, I do right now. And so this led to a partial diagnosis of, quote, acute paranoia. And I was administered hefty doses of antipsychotics that kept me out of sorts for most of my duration there. But what I can say is while I was hospitalized, I was, bona fide paranoid. But solely because there was, something, I felt like there was something gravely wrong with me that nobody was telling me about. And I think most young queer people feel this way, drugged or not. So the psychiatrist treating me reinforced this, reinforced this by reminding me that homosexuality had been listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and that if I felt, quote, urges, then they could be medically treated. And so this was in 1998. So I was discharged from Friends Hospital that following January, or at least I remember it being January. Back then, it always was January. I was still not prepared to come out as gay, and the feelings of guilt and paranoia were far from subsiding. But I was able to move more fluidly through the day and get myself out of bed, bathe and eat a meal or two, find my socks, that sort of shit. I also appeared stable enough for my friend Beth, a poet and former classmate, to trust me to sublet her studio. It was an apartment off of Rittenhouse Square in Philly, in a building that perpetually smelled like Old Spice. It had a creaking gated elevator, and it was packed with these loony neighbors, like the schizophrenic woman next door who wore the same soiled nightgown all day and blasted the Turtles happy together 24/7. The song is running for me. But Beth left behind 2 books, right? So Beth left behind 2 books in her apartment. There was Derrida's The Postcard, and then Burroughs' The Wild Boys. I'd already read the postcard and consumed an inordinate amount of Derrida for a person my age, having been mentored by the poet John Taggart while I was studying at Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania. John was a father figure to me those years, and he was a deconstructionist freak. So his poetry descended from the objective school, and he had me reading loads of George Oppin and Louis Zukofsky and H.D., which I was grateful for. But John was also a wonderful snob, and if he liked you, he would let you in on his snobbery. And so if John pronounced another writer as a hack, that would become law to me. So case in point, I once brought up wanting to read Naked Lunch to, just see what it was all about. And John scoffed at this endeavor, dismissing Burroughs' ode as, quote, smoke and mirrors. In the end, I was left with the impression that Burroughs, both men in his writing, were the embodiment of the quasi-intellectual rock star author, from which budding serious writers should best steer clear. But now here I was in Beth's empty apartment, and I had a lot of time to fill and no money to go out and buy books. And so I read The Wild Boys. It was my first real exposure to Burroughs, and I quickly realized that at last I had stumbled upon a voice of reason. People seem incredulous when I tell them, that nothing in The Wild Boys or any of Burroughs' work makes me hard. I'll be perfectly shamelessly honest with you. It's because when I read passages like, he spreads his legs and I slide it in, slow feeling the ring squeeze me, and I can tell when he spurts. I cannot get the oft-recorded sound of Burroughs' nasal grumble out of my head. It's like a major turnoff. Sorry. So therein lies the perils of writers' cult of personality trumping his artistic intent, I suppose. But I argue that the titillation is not the ultimate intent of Burroughs' erotic writing. For me, The Wild Boys is much more than a work of queer erotica. It's one of the America's enduring texts on freedom, and it's in good company with the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, with Walden, with Their Eyes Were Watching God. So to that end, the lyric scene of orgies and onanism that Burroughs meticulously renders in the novel are all in service to self-determination, and the sex portrayed in the novel is meant to be transformative, both for the characters and in the world they seek to disrupt. As a writer, an important lesson I learned from Burroughs is that the sex your characters experience has to be transcendent. Not in that it's physically pleasurable to them, but that it's revelatory for them, enabling an ego death, causing them to emerge post-orgasm as a new person. George Bataille taught me a similar lesson in Madame Edwarda and in the Dead Man, probably the most important thing I ever read. The timing of the publication of The Wild Boys in 1969 coincided with the Stonewall riots and mass nationwide coming out. So queers were now moving from the closet, a place Burroughs viewed as a temporary autonomous zone, into a more visible position in mainstream life. And at the time, Burroughs was skeptical of this move, fearing that the radical nature of queerness, which mostly emanated from the queer ability to stay hidden and to do as one pleased, would be lost. It's a sentiment that's resonant in Martin Luther King's fear that at the conclusion of the civil rights movement, that Black people were being integrated into a burning house. And that house being a capitalist warmonger in America. So in Wild Boys, American paranoia is embodied by the CIA, which true to real life exists for the sole purpose of violently crushing any meaningful movement against the heterosexual capitalist power structure. In the case of the novel, the CIA has one goal: bring the Wild Boys to heel, to end the orgies, the drugs, all the talk of not wanting to go to work and being left alone to ride horses and shoot arrows. Before delving into Burroughs' depiction of the CIA, it would be worthwhile to take a brief look at just what the CIA is. I mean, I think vast majorities of people are confused on what the agency is and what its function is. I mean, perhaps the best way to think about the CIA is from the Martian's perspective. A Martian, to his chagrin, ends up crashed on Earth. He comes to you with one question: what is the CIA? You avail him of nothing but the documents that are part of the public record. After reading through these documents, that Martian can entirely, justifiably, deduce that the CIA is the world's largest, most lucrative drug cartel. Why all the drugs? That's the bigger question. Well, the mounting counter leftist insurgencies in nations replete with natural resources that wealthy white Americans assume are theirs, that doesn't pay for itself. And ultimately, what the CIA is, it's a private invasion force for American elites to decide what they need, whether it's lithium in Bolivia or bananas in Honduras. Really, that's it. That's really all it is. In terms of domestic operations, which is absolutely, take place despite domestic surveillance preclusion on the books, the CIA is there to ensure that no leftist movement takes shape on our soil. The inconvenient truth exemplified in The Wild Boys, as a horrified CIA agent reports in his book: all over America, kids like Johnny are deserting this country and their great American heritage, suborned by the false promises of Moscow into a life of drugs and vice. I say to you all that whichever anarchy, vice, and foul corruption rears the swollen hood of the cobra to strike at everything that we hold sacred. In Lawrence, Kansas, M, this is my ex, and I drove to Burroughs' house, a single-story rancher on a suburban residential block. The house, as far as I know, was now privately owned off limits to visitors. However, there was nothing stopping him and I from taking pictures in front of it. I remarked how fitting it was that at a distance, the front windows of Burroughs' house that were curtained behind an apron or Indian bean tree, this big Indian bean tree, appeared as two paranoid eyes peering through the Venetian blinds, anticipating the arrival of some agent of ill intent. The black books that M was keeping dated back to the very beginning of our relationship, back to the days of his stark CIA agent conjuring apartment. The books detailed what can only be described as his debilitating sex addiction. The addiction being the need to have unprotected, receptive, oral and anal sex with strangers in cruise public toilets throughout New York City, including all of these in the black books. He would describe each episode in detail in a sad language. I did this today because I wanted to celebrate. I did this today because I felt bad. And then I remember, the black books also contain a lot of notes and a list of who I was hanging out with and what I was doing at particular times. So, my interest in Burroughs was described in the books as, quote, Jason loves a writer who hates America. It was long. All right, so last very short section. While my friend Justin and I sunbathed on the beach, he remarked that the dunes in Provincetown had shifted significantly to the south over the years, and that the tide was coming in much higher and for much longer. The observation of that recent hurricane made it clear to us. Climate collapse was in full swing, and the enablers of global warming, or at least the financial beneficiaries of it, were all around us. And all around us with their identical dicks hanging out. Lying there, taking in the sun, the gaggle of finance guys that set up camp next to Justin and me were, of course, banging on about the real estate grabs in DC and Boston. Their discussion then turned to sex. Again, the penis of someone's late night conquest had now metamorphosed into a hoagie. Do you want this hoagie? Oh, no. I had a hoagie last night, if you want it. I'm so fucking tired of this shit. I'm fucking weak of hearing that shit. The conversation was driving me to the brink of fuck fatigue, and I hadn't had sex or pursued it this entire trip. In fact, my entire time in Provincetown, I felt like
an unexpected equanimity that eclipsed any libido. I chalked it up to my prescriptions of Lamictal for depression, Seroquel for insomnia, and Prazosin for nightmares. I told Justin that I was leaving, and I was going to leave the beach, and I was heading for a bike ride with the hopes to, spotting a coyote, which is all I really wanted to do in Provincetown. So on the walk back to the main road, you descend the dunes. I don't have to tell you people this, how this works, right? You descend the dunes into the pristine wetlands that become temporary tide pools twice a day. The pools are usually scattered with orgies at pretty much any time. The men were usually in the deeper end of the pool, far from the dunes, and I could never really make out individual participants. From the distance, they always looked like beige mineral deposits. As I walked along the shore of the tidal pools to find the path back to the main road, 3 nude figures emerged from the water. There was a man probably in his late 60s, a younger man maybe in his 30s, and still a younger one in his early 20s. They all had impeccable bodies, and it could have been the same man who had, been divvied up and displaced in time, like a sort of homosexual riddle of the Sphinx. They walked on ahead of me, and I was privy to the post-fuck conversation. The oldest man invited the other 2 back to his boat that he had docked nearby. The youngest man said that he could only imagine what the folks back at the office would think if they saw him now. "What is it you do?" asked the oldest man. "Oh, I'm in finance," he said. And the other 2 men said that they were also in finance, and they all laughed and laughed. And then there before me walked 3 hunks emerging from their orgy and returning back to their stock options. So I thought of Burroughs. I thought of Wild Boys and how in 2021, sex alone was not going to hearten the revolution. Probably wasn't even going to save us individually either. I spotted some coyote tracks and realized that maybe lately I had no libido because I was done seeking lovers and I was in search of recruits. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, everyone, so much for coming. My name is Sam Desmond. I'm a reporter based out on Long Island, and I cover many events where people are starting a new business or launching a new product. And I really have to say, when people make the effort to come out for it, it really does make all the difference. So for everyone who supported an artist or is an artist themselves, give yourself a pat on the back for that. So as a local reporter, one of the words I use the most is community. And with what Brian and Tom have done, it really is a way of bringing their entire community into a project. I've known Brian for about 10 years now. And what's great about Brian is whatever laurels he has, he's always willing to share them with everybody else. And I think that sets him apart from so many other people. So kudos to you, my friend. So as I said, I live out on Long Island. I'm a local reporter, which probably explains why I have the shortest and the straightest essay in the book. I realized I was bisexual as a teenager because of Britney Spears. So basically what I'm saying is I'm basic, and I'm very happy to be included in this book despite that. So as a local reporter, the paper that I write for, the Long Island Advance, this past year won a New York Press Association award, a community leadership award for our coverage of the LGBTQ community, which I felt was so significant because we were not an LGBTQ publication, but to have stories about drag queens or a teacher in the elementary school transitioning right next to, boys varsity lacrosse. You know, I've always felt as somebody who had a foot in each world, and to have all of those stories together. We only lost 2 subscribers, which is great. And one of our longest running subscribers, a man in his 80s, after we ran a story about a local drag queen at a cat cafe. Yes, pussy jokes galore. So after we ran an article with her on the front page, he called and he actually said, "Thank you so much for putting a gorgeous, glamorous woman on the cover." So, you know, as horrible as things can be, I always feel like I'm on the front lines of integrating things. So, you know, as strong as our community is, it can coexist and be with other communities. And I think, you know, for every young queer child who grew up in towns, in small towns all across the country, that is a meaningful thing to see, especially in local media. So with that, when I was asked to be in this book, I told Brian absolutely not, because I heard who was going to be in it, and I was like, I don't want to feel bad. So for about a month, I think I just told Brian no, and he was like, "Stop it, you're great," because that is how wonderful Brian is. And so I wrote the book because, as I said, you know, I've always felt like I was in 2 worlds, where the main world and the queer world, or the, you know, a heterosexual world. I mean, the tall, handsome, blonde wasp in the back who looks like he should be throwing a football is my husband. So, you know, I've always had the privilege to be able to pass and, I guess, not have to show who I am, but I've always wanted to show who I am. So when I approached this essay, I really thought of the idea of the periphery being central. And in that regard, I thought of William Burroughs' wife, who, as we know, died tragically at his hands. But, you know, her story and the stories I guess I'm drawn to as a Long Island housewife tend to deal with women who have resources at their disposal. So Joan, to me, is one of those women, and someone who doesn't get as much attention as she should under the weight of Burroughs' genius. So with that is a section from my essay, whose title I kind of forgot, The Gift of the Tortured Spectre. Joan Vollmer, born only 6 years before Jacqueline Kennedy, was one of those women. The wife of William S. Burroughs, she was both an ornament and gravitational pull of the Beat generation. Dying at 28 under the horrific circumstances of a botched William Tell endeavor by Burroughs, a story he would go back and forth on, he cemented her place as the tragic Ophelia of the generation because she wouldn't be able to go on to create her own story. Between being introduced to Benzedrine in 1945 and to Burroughs in 1946 by Ginsberg, Joan would be both a launching pad and punching bag for what fueled the destructive, chaotic beauty of the Beat generation. Even with Allen Ginsberg stepping in to convince Burroughs to end the affair, Joan remained and gave birth to their child in 1947, perhaps the most tangible of Burroughs' legacy to the general public. In Kentucky Ham, William Jr.'s novel, published in 1973, we get an homage to a caring but tragically self-destructive mother who is a pawn to the machinations and whims of her equally drug-addled husband. But despite the chaotic, unstructured life of Joan, she was still a woman I wanted to be. Born into an upper middle class family and eschewing the comfortable life that would have been her fate, much like Jackie Kennedy, she became a muse, a siren, and the genesis of the greatest countercultural arts movement of the 20th century. During one of her affairs, Joan wrote term papers for her baby-faced 19-year-old lover who attended Columbia University. An essay she wrote for him on Dryden was so admired by a professor for its clever wit and understanding of Dryden that her young lover was afraid of being expelled for plagiarizing her work. Muses, especially to men, often remain on a pedestal because they do not tell their own tales and have to wait for someone else to discover their own innate talents, separate from inspiring a grand man. Similar to Lawrence Leamer's treatment of the alluring wives and daughters in the Kennedy Women, the saga of an American family, Barry Miles's Call Me Burroughs tries to tell the story of Joan as a force of her own, but she cannot escape the male gaze that pigeonholes women to nurturing origin points for men's accomplishments. But if the Beat Generation captured from Joan's perspective in a treatment like Oates' Blonde, would she be better off than in descriptions by a man? Or would she just lose the patina of grace afforded to her by authors who didn't condemn her for her lack of responsible motherhood? Male writers will focus on beauty and youthful exuberance and forgive all of this is maintained, but women will not forgive a bad mother. One of Jackie Kennedy's idols was Evangeline Bruce, who in C. David Hyman's The Georgetown Ladies Social Club is described as a bit of a femme fatale with hostessing skills that the State Department relied upon for the most delicate situations with foreign diplomats. But what has held her back from being heralded as a brilliant woman ahead of her time is that she was also an absent mother, whose first daughter was so distraught and disconnected from her, she died by suicide before 30. Joan was a woman I saw myself in, a maddening mind and uncontrollable compulsions to self-medicate, all the while trying to anchor herself in a traditional relationship with a man whose own genius was beyond control. Thank you.
There we go. All right, so I'm Sven Davisson. I run a little thing called Repository Press.
All right.
I think of a better 20th anniversary for the press than this book. And I don't know if Tom knew of my personal obsession with Burroughs going back to at least I was 14, 15 when he approached me with the book. So good coincidence there. And my first foray into publishing was a zine back in 89, 90, which is based on Burroughs and Jason's Mektow, which lasted several years, which is good for the zine culture of the time. And I remember when Tom broached the subject that Brian and he were thinking about this book, you know, someone posted a picture, a drawing they did of Burroughs on Facebook just like last week. So I scrolled back through because I had to find it because it worked perfectly as a cover. And of course, it was Brian's illustration. Wanted to keep secret that he did that. So, I mean, this is a great book. And I wish the trolls on Facebook would read Sam's essay. But there's only been a few of them. A lot of people say, I got to get this book, which is happy to see. So I'm just going to sort of do a peer-to-Dubé style gloss of my piece rather than trying to read it. So mine's a little bit different, maybe. You know, there are a lot of queer writers that I grafted to during my teenage years. Naked Lunch didn't really capture me, though I read it because I had to, because I was into Kerouac and Ginsberg, etc. Then I hit Wild Boys, Court of Saints, and then during college, it was the Cities of the Red Night, Places Dead Roads, and Western Lands trilogy. And then it was just, so mine is, that Burroughs isn't just queer, that's sort of, yeah, of course. But he's also writing a queer shamanic mythology that is almost unique. I mean, I can think of maybe a few others who've experimented in that domain. Mr. Crowley, but I don't think he did it as well or as artfully. It certainly was at least as problematic, if not more. He didn't shoot a wife, but he certainly had someone commit suicide and a few other things. And then I got to thinking about so Burroughs actually was very involved, very interested in the occult. So it wasn't just in his writing. His writing and his personal life and his personal views crossed over a lot. And sometimes he's writing an essay, sometimes he's writing fiction, and sometimes the lines just blur. So that last trilogy really takes a lot of that, but in the former genre fiction, there's pirates, there's Wild Wests, there's Norman Mailer inspired Egyptian mythology. Speaking of a heterosexual man who almost everyone's forgotten stabbed his wife at a party, almost killing her, right? Anyway, so my piece is queering chaos, because as Burroughs was writing this, the chaos magical movement was also coming up, which intersects at some point. So there's my introduction. So Burroughs and his literary alter egos were outspoken in their belief in the magical universe and the existence of an afterlife. For him, the world, as well as his novels, consists of a universe populated by diverse gods, spirits, and ghosts. The threat of possession was very real and ever present. He personally felt himself stalked by an entity he termed the ugly spirit, and he blamed several times the accidental shooting of his wife, Joan, during William Tell Act on possession by this malevolent spirit. To Burroughs, the one God universe, with his bearded, benevolent father figure, who yet lets bad things happen, was a logical impasse. Irrevocably thermodynamic. For him, the only cosmological model that made sense was a universe populated by numerous gods, often operating from points of competing interests. Likewise, he viewed coincidence as a mechanism of control used to obscure the universe's true magical nature. In Burroughs' view, there are no accidents. Nothing happens unless someone wills it to happen. And an extended quote. Like The Great Gatsby, and not in Burroughs' voice, because I can't do it either.
No one can.
But I agree, his voice is also his writing. Like The Great Gatsby, Kim believes in the green light, the orgiastic future. He believes in a magical universe, unpredictable, spontaneous, alive. A universe where anything is possible. A universe of many gods, often in conflict. So the paradox of an all-knowing, all-powerful God who nonetheless permits suffering, evil, and death does not arise. And that actually is an excerpt from a Toronto Poetry Systems record, the best of William S. Burroughs. Burroughs' interest in writing in the occult intersected in the magical power of the written word. He first encountered this concept while in Morocco. When Brian Alessandro operated his cafe, he discovered a cursed object, presumably set against him. Inside was written a curse, closing with the word "makto," or "it is written." The act of writing itself is a magical one. William Lee, one of the author's many alter egos, is writing his way out of death. The very act of literary creation is a ritual in and of itself. For Burroughs, this carried through as an interest in occult grimoires and hidden books. Burroughs wrote evocatively of lost Mayan codices and even the dread Necronomicon of Lovecraftian fiction. In Cities of the Red Night actually includes calls to many gods, including Cthulhu spelled with a K, even though Lovecraft spelled it with a C. And at the time, Burroughs was living in New York. So 1977, the Schlangenkraft Necronomicon was being produced by Magical Child, probably authored by Peter Levenda. I think pretty much everyone agrees that is Simon. So this was Necronomicon of the Lovecraftian mythical grimoire. And the Magical Child was sort of the nexus of occult New York in the 1970s. It was on 35 West 19th Street. So Burroughs, hearing that this drag grimoire was being produced in the neighborhood, he goes down to the publisher and hangs out with the illustrator, looks over some of the pages, proof pages, does a couple of lines of white powder, and then proclaims it good shit. And no one knows if he's talking about the book or the powder he had just done. And of course, Burroughs is also highly influential in other, in the occult music genres with Psychic TV, Coil, Throbbing Bristle, Generous George, was very connected. And then that led him to the Chaos Magicians. Peter Carroll, Phil Hine, Burroughs actually blurbed one of his books, and Phil Hine used one of Burroughs' paintings for a cover. And all these folks visited him in Lawrence, Kansas over the years. And which is not as widely known, Burroughs actually took initiation in the Illuminatus of Thanateros, which is Peter Carroll's Chaos Magical Order, and according to Douglas Grant, at least, is buried with a chaos ring on his hand. And I think it's no coincidence that chaos magic and queer politics actually arose at the same time. They both exist in a space that is simultaneously transcultural and transtemporal. Each was in part a reactive alternative to pervading cultural ethos. Chaos magic pushed back at a headwind of rigid occult traditionalism based on a mostly fabricated historicity. Queer, on the other hand, was a determined cultural and political reaction to the pervading critical debate between essentialist and constructionist camps in an analyzing expressions of same-sex desire. Burroughs' writing in a similar space, apart from linear time, with settings as varied as pirate enclaves, the Wild West, and ancient Egypt. There has been much discussion and critical writing around certain aspects of Burroughs' occult interests. His use of the cut-up technique, rediscovered with his magical co-explorer, Brian Alessandro, his application of playback to control crowds and disturb cafes, which is the only thing he talked to Page about when they met, because he was absolutely obsessed with the ability to control crowds. In contrast, and also he was fascinated by William Wright, which is widely talked about, and had a orgone energy machine that he moved with him from place to place. And when he taught at Naropa, he did a whole class of the wishing machine, which is a machine that you could build to make your wishes come true. And the class, for the first half at least, thought it was a joke, and then realized it was serious at a certain point. In contrast, comparatively little has been written about his male plus male shamanism that weaves its way throughout his mythology of the space age, the wild boys and beyond. And I'm over my 5 minutes, so I'll leave it there.
We've come full circle. As I promised, I would read the last 2 pages of my conclusion, which looks at December 1995, January 1996, while I was in Morocco and still very much in the closet, and had just discovered Burroughs just prior to that trip. Before I do read, though, I want to just tell you briefly about a conversation I had with Dennis Leroy Kangalee about a week ago. He said, "Do you know what you've done?" And I said, "No, what I do." He said, "With this book, do you have any concept of what you and Tom have done?" And I said, we've been so mired in it for the past year and a half that we haven't had a chance to take a step back and look. And tonight I had a chance to look, and it almost moved me to tears. So thank you to the contributors, all 25 of you, and the 10 of you who are here tonight. I think it's safe to say I now know what we've done. So I was 28 when I first kissed a man, got naked with a man, had sex with a man. He was a photographer with a yen for much older lovers. Being a year his senior rendered me too young. Our intimacy was at first awkward, but then warm and temporarily even hot. More sensual than sexual, he preferred a deferential posture, revealed commitment issues that I learned would be common in the community. And after 2 months, the affair ended as unceremoniously as it had begun. I was rid of presentiment, free of clandestine fancies and exploited beards. The need for Burroughs dissipated in that encounter. Naked Lunch had satisfied its mission. As Burroughs asserted, it is not the intensity, but the duration of pain that breaks the will to resist. My connection with Burroughs and his surreal work might have made me a more interesting person, for having remained in the shadows for as long as I had, for having endured, for having gone without, for having been a convincing liar. The modern world of gay rights and gay love is a beautiful reality, albeit not nearly as intriguing as the universe Naked Lunch had intimated. I'm grateful for the privileges we are now afforded, but also glamorously bored by them too. As Burroughs asserted, the broken image of man moves in minute by minute and cell by cell. Poverty, hatred, war, police criminals, bureaucracy, insanity, all symptoms of the human virus. At 20, a year and change after reading my introduction to Naked Lunch and Morocco, I read and was again reshaped by Junkie. In fact, I endeavored to option the rights to the novel and even started prematurely adapting it into a screenplay. The Wiley agency, who had managed Burroughs' estate, entertained my precocity as my bid reached $8,000, which at the time was all the money I had saved in the world. It being 1997, $8,000 was a respectful sum for temporary access to an obscure novella. My pursuit ended 2 months after it had begun when the agency informed me that I had been outbid by the actor Steve Buscemi. True story. Who 24 years later has yet to realize the cinematic promise of the book. What is he doing? If anybody knows Steve, ask him if their rights are still available, and I will happily buy them. I have more than $8,000 now to offer. In Marrakesh, one of the young American women on our tour took a photo of two men, Tuareg Berbers, walking in front of a produce stand. Their heads and mouths were wrapped in blue and saffron cloth, indigo dyed. The men became enraged with the women for sneaking a photo without permission and insisted upon payment for the infraction or the camera. I couldn't be sure, as I didn't understand Arabic. It had not been in my nature to fight. I attempted apologies and reasons, explanation of my cultural ignorance and monetary concession. The men were visibly confused and then annoyed by my entreaties, my hemming and hawing, my cowardly obsequiousness. They'd misread the display. I hadn't been frightened, rather diplomatic, intent on resolving an issue in which they'd been wronged, albeit unintentionally. The women rushed back onto the tour bus and our guide settled the dispute with money at the threshold. Apparently the men had brandished daggers. Even at that young age, I understood the dangerous entitlement of Westerners, taking what they wanted without impunity, no matter the harm, and leaving the resolution of that harm to others. It's no secret that most teenagers feel alienated and put upon by the adult world of establishments and arbitrary values. The institutions of heteronormativity, conformity, and capitalism had felt oppressive and imposing to my 18-year-old brain. Finding Burroughs in Morocco while being too spooked to exit the closet provided me strange solace. My own undercover explorations of alien sensations and territories gave me permission to remain concealed, to stay a spy, a queer in hetero clothing. All these years later, his literature has retained its resonance, a protest against social compacts I'd never signed, and an embrace of misanthropy, a cozying up to radical tenets. And yet his revolution is fought gently, as dare I say, meekly, as a priest. As I get increasingly acclimated to a quiet adulthood, to my own bourgeoisie comforts, the comforts that kept me disingenuous all those years, I seek again a channel to sate a secretive extremist hunger, to look again at the world and at myself, no matter how ugly, how unappetizing, regardless of my metabolism. The frozen moment when one sees what is at the end of the fork. You want to come up and say goodbye, everyone? So that concludes our program for this evening. We still have a couple of copies left, I guess, for sale. And Tom, any closing remarks? Thank you again for your contributions and for coming out tonight.
No questions, only praise. So,
Oh, yeah.
any questions?
Yeah, we have.
More praise.
We still have like 10 minutes technically. I mean, if there are questions, if not, we can get to the selling and the signing. You have 11 contributors here. Just saying. A once in a lifetime opportunity. Okay, let's go.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Got a question? What's next? Very
He's got a
quickly,
lot
what's next for us? Tom, what's next for you?
I am partnering with Rebel Satori. We have started a new imprint. Great setup. A new imprint called the Library of Homosexual Congress. We will be bringing back into print lost gay classics from the 50s, 60s, 70s, some really hot shit from the 90s. Very excited. Look for our first book in December.
In November, Top Shelf Productions and Penguin Random House will finally release the graphic novel adaptation of Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story, which Michael Carroll, Igor Karash, and I have been working on for 5.5 years. We're very excited. We just got a blurb from Alison Bechdel. We got a blurb from John Irving. We got a blurb from Andre Hasselman, A.M. Holmes. And then in March 2023, thereabouts, Rebel Satori will publish my second novel, Performer Non Grata. Thank you so much.
We'll pick up the chairs. If you want to push them to the side and hang out, please do. Don't mind us. We'll take them away as you're hanging out.